Come back here and sit your chairs.
So I go off and control that. Otherwise, and we're productive.
So that we can define a common format for both.
Right. You mean the reference model and or manifest? Okay. Yeah, I understand. Yes. And the real address. Yes. Should be the same. Yes. I agree. Yes. But it's not a very quick thing that we can solve them both. So I think that both the most important part.
Assuming the house is cut off, assuming one of those says, take away explicit attestation. They use it for implicit attestation. My chapter now. And the verifier has to be Is there another kind of fun?
That's a great default. So I can use the.
That's something wrong with
being weird or I think if you do this, it'll work better.
This is why your people are all invaluable. To save us each from ourselves. I need a volunteer for Jabber Scribe. No, and I'm losing my chair. Get a Jabber Scribe? Who's going to Jabber Scribe?
Yeah, I'll need to log in, but yeah, I should be able to.
You can delegate.
Wait, I thought he said he was going to be full-time Jabber Scribe.
Yeah, I hope so.
But I'll also Jabber Scribe.
There you go. And we have a winner.
I am presenting, so somebody will have to pick up the slack.
Got it. Anybody else wants to, back up Steven as Jabber Scribe is welcome. I think so. It's either that or the echoes in my head.
Those are pretty reliable.
Or both.
Yeah. Could be, but we should get started. Right.
I'll do this part. Okay, good morning. It is still morning. Okay, good morning. This is the SACM working group. This is the note well, which you have seen, which you agreed to when you signed up for the IETF, and which you will have been reminded of a number of times since. If you have any questions about that, be sure to see Chris. Next slide. This is our agenda for the day. Is there any agenda bashing? Nope. Okay. We have scribes and we have a minute taker, so we are good to go. Yeah. Stephen, you are on deck.
I don't even need it. I only have one other slide. All right. This should be very short and very easy. So I recently just pushed a new version of the Rolly software descriptor draft. I think technically I actually pushed two versions, like in quick succession. The first one was just updating the draft because it had expired. And the second one was a very small number of editorial fixes. There's no major content updates, and then there were one or two like to-do placeholder texts that I filled in as well. Next slide, please. At this point, I pretty strongly believe that the document is ready for a working group last call, and to use that to drive the final stages of review for the document. So I'd like to ask for that, ask the group and the chairs on what they think about that.
Is there anybody opposed to the working group doing a last call on this? I know the chairs are strongly in favor of it. Okay. Oh, yes. So it would be nice if we had a couple people that will commit to reviewing this. Any hands for folks that are willing to review?
It's not super long.
Short draft?
Thank you, Jess.
One person? Can we get at least 2 people committing to review?
Lou, let's get very engaged right at this moment. What do you think about reviewing the draft? Nice.
I was about to call out Mike Rosa over there looking passive, so you saved him.
No, I'm waiting for the bigger draft.
This will this will teach Lou not to sit on the front.
He made eye contact, and that was the mistake.
All right, so we have a couple volunteers, and I think that's about it.
Cool.
Thank you for doing that.
Thanks. I might post another version just because I think there was a metadata error on the 04, and it's like literally the smallest possible change.
Well, could you make that smallest possible change like today?
How about I go do it right now?
That'd be fabulous.
All right.
There it is.
It does. Where do I click? Anywhere?
Okay. Not really on it though. That's okay. All right. I'm going to start with talking about the hackathon efforts, and then I'll go into some more architecture-related things as well. So a couple of weeks ago, when setting up the sort of project for the hackathon, looking at the architecture draft and kind of looking at some of the XMPP components, that were illustrated in the draft there. I wanted to try and get a couple of those XMPP-based clients together, an orchestrator, an endpoint, and a repository sort of examples, kind of stubbing a few things out, but allowing some of the traffic to go between them and transfer some information, orchestrate some collection activities perhaps, retrieve and push some information into a quote unquote repository, I guess, and do that. So to do that, it was going to start using the extensibility of XMPP and create some extensions to perform those operations between the components. So again, kind of want to query a repository to grab some content, or at least pointers to content, things like that, and then instruct the endpoint to perform an assessment. All I had was an assessor and not just a decoupled collector / evaluator. So just kind of had to use the tools that I had on hand. So at the hackathon, a little bit before the hackathon, I had some communications with Hank, and so he brought a colleague, Carl Hines, to the hackathon, and brought an implementation of a map client and server, basically a pub sub broker that can basically the map client can publish information to the map server, which then and that was all sort of CBOR encoded information, links, metadata in there, and store that into an object-based sort of graph data model. So what we did at the beginning, first we kind of had our introductions and went over what each of our pieces of software did, and talked a little bit about how we could integrate the two components and see how they could work together. So we decided on a couple of workflows that we wanted to try. The first was basically in the stuff that I brought in the XMPP clients that were there to implement that as one of the map clients as well, so we could publish information to the map server and store it in the graph, which we were able to do. And then the more complicated example, which we did on the second day, was actually to kind of do the reverse of that. We took the map client and made that into its own little XMPP client, and then we sort of orchestrated a full-on publish-subscribe workflow where an orchestrator would publish guidance to collect. A collector would do we sort of stubbed out a little bit of collection activities. It would publish those results back where the map clients was subscribed then to that topic, grabbed that information and pushed it into that graph data model. So we were able to see that and retrieve all that information and get a dump of all of that. And again, it was all nicely CBOR encoded, so it was pretty tiny bits of information that worked really fast. Yeah, so I guess I just sort of covered these two slides in the last one there. So again, sort of started with making my XMPP client able to talk to the map client, and then made it more difficult to add the XMPP adapter to the map client so the publish subscribe workflow would work. So what we learned first off in a lot of the introductions that the map server and that graph data model was really actually great for the repository information. So we could really store any of that collection information, any of that data, along with metadata, along with links between all of that stuff, and it looked really promising to move forward. And also, it kind of helped to inform that the current architecture document really, a lot of the diagrams and things like that are focused more on the transport aspects. So a lot of those examples with XMPP than it does on the actual integrations and interoperability between components. So we kind of had that as a nice takeaway from the hackathon. And then what's next? Well, I'm going to consult my notes a little bit. Yeah. So we want to keep doing this and keep going with the progress that we made on the hackathons. You know, an idea of having interim hackathons and kind of working in a distributed way was talked a little bit about as well. And then really kind of built on those lessons learned to kind of focus on really defining the interactions between the components and using that to help refine the draft and things like that. We also kind of had a realization, you know, sort of at the beginning of the hackathon that, you know, the preparations and planning for all of the hackathon efforts could have been better instead of just sort of showing up at the beginning of the hackathon and, you know, kind of talking about what we might be able to do with the different pieces to kind of maybe hold a couple of calls or meetings or whatever beforehand to have a little bit better planning for what we're going to do going forward. I'm happy to take the lead on doing that as I've been kind of coordinating the hackathons in the past. Kind of missed terms for reviving the information model, but kind of want to kind of retake a look at some of the information elements there and start to really get that down to a minimum sort of level of information and data elements that to help facilitate the interactions. The next steps is really to sort of start really creating those data models and really defining those interactions between the components. And just wanted to give a big shout to Karl Heinz for his contributions to the hackathon. So Hank, if you pass that on, it's very much appreciated. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it for the hackathon things. Any questions on what we did for that? Sweet. Good. All right. big letters. Is that gonna work? Oh, it's just sort of scrolling.
Just go down to the bottom.
That's better. All right. Still just scrolling. We'll scroll a little bit. Oh yeah, that's better. All right. All right, architecture draft. It was about to expire, so we made some updates and published the 01 version. Minimally cleaned up a few spelling errors. There was an overview diagram that we added a little bit of extra notations to kind of illustrate that external data feeds can contribute to policies within an enterprise, and we sort of drew the line there to illustrate the boundary between the enterprise and those external data feeds. We simplified a couple of one of the diagrams to just kind of take a little bit of the bulk out of the diagrams. So it was kind of mentioning all of the sort of XMPP connectors and different flavors of collection capabilities. We just sort of narrowed that down and called it one collector component with an with the XMPP adapter in it. Put a lot of descriptive information about some of the XMPP extension protocols that we think were useful in this sort of data flow. Just a part, kind of building on some of the things that were in the MILE working group with the publish subscribe. We found in previous hackathons that sort of helped inform this before, that other extensions would be useful. To kind of leverage larger policy definition structures, some of the, oval definition files or, XML-based checklists or anything like that are kind of large data sets which have a hard time going through the standard publish subscribes. You kind of have to work around it a little bit to move that bulk of information. And other potential things that would be helpful in the workflow for onboarding new endpoint components and things of that nature. So we added a bunch of descriptive information to those to that section. And then section 3.3 added a very, very large diagram that actually put in a great amount of ASCII art to show the endpoint posture collection protocol in the actual model as one of those collectors. So it's like a full page diagram. Looks pretty awesome. Again, kind of intertwining that with the information that we gleaned from the hackathon, showed again that we were fairly focused on the actual transport and kind of hardlining it towards XMPP, but found that we were it was very beneficial to have the sort of map client and that graph data model to use as a repository, and just to allow for interoperability between the different components and different ways to implement those components. So it helped us, with the idea that, again, we kind of really need to focus on the interactions instead of really how it's being built. So I think this is that the last one? Yeah. So this is the last one, last slide about proposed direction. Again, we've got a very XMPP-centric view of the in the draft. So we're looking for, I guess, input direction on if we should sort of leave those components as they are in the draft, or if we should maybe move those anything specific to XMPP or specific to specific implementations, maybe to an appendix or even another draft or anything like that, and then attempt to refocus really on the interactions, as I've mentioned a number of times, and then start really looking towards the an extensible registry, I guess, of those information elements. We kind of, again, want to start with something basic that we can start building those interactions out, and then continue working towards those at future hackathons. even if that's just one component to another component going forward, I'm happy to, entertain any sort of suggestions, and we want some feedback on the draft. Keep moving it forward. That's, I guess, what we need, and any amount of constructive criticism on the list, we're happy to integrate in going forward. I think that's it.
Has anyone read the latest version? How long has it been up, Bill?
Few weeks. February.
February
So
22nd
like a
was
month.
the answer. Has anybody read the latest version? All right, we've got like two, but one of those is the author. We really need more reviews and more people reading the draft. That would be huge. Can some people commit to actually reading it? It's actually still not very long.
Can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
From Xiaohui, what is a graph data model?
So maybe Hank can help answer that a little bit better with the data model that's used in the map server.
Oh, yeah.
Quick answer.
Sorry, I just had to run to Acme not to tell them to do stuff. And then I ran back here because I forgot my headphone. So this is the architecture.
Yeah.
And the question is, sorry, I just re-entered the room.
What's the map?
What's the map
Oh.
server and graph data model?
Yeah, okay. Inside the graph, there is no prescription how to store the data. You can do it whatever you want on a piece of paper, whatever. So we only define data in motion. And the data model for data in motion basically is a nested message protocol that does not require anything but a secure channel such as TLS. And there will be messages, and the messages are either client created or server created. So this is the first distinction. There's always an application association, and the data model inside is basically always a container containing two identifiers, so the two nodes, and one link, one metadata item. So, and all of these three items can have a multitude of attributes associated to them when being published to the graph. They also have 2 times of lifetime. One of them is infinite. So even if the application association dies, the data will still remain in the graph, or you just give an expiration date with it, so it will be removed automatically from the graph. If you do infinite lifetimes all the time, you need something like a garbage collector at some point, otherwise it will explode. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess it's a good way to define like really the nodes and the relationships between them using metadata. So then it's a interesting way to then query based on those relationships.
Yeah, thank you. I think it answered my question, and I assume that there are some benefit use this data model for what kind of information you need to collect, right? So you use this kind of information that it can bring you a lot of benefit to show their relation, something. So I need to review the document.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I think any the contribution comments about certain information that's helpful to create some of those relationships we'll take. Yeah.
So this is Hank again. The data model is very context agnostic. So our first example was minions and bananas, and that they like them. So our meta first data was like. So you can really create whatever you want to store in there. And I think that's very important to highlight. Also, it is the place to get a bigger picture overview for everything that's happening or supposed to happen, and the state the processes are in. So it's originally it was used for authentication state. So which devices are authenticated, which devices to go into the network, why. And this is a very specific purpose, and we just crushed that and did all put all the nice pieces, put it into CBOR and CDDL, and it works quite well, as we can see.
It does, yeah. So yeah, people, ideas, criticism, we'll take it all.
So Adam asked a little while ago if there was anybody committing to review, and we didn't really get adequate response. So you're committed to review. Who was the other person that was committed to review this? One.
Mike just came. Mike just came.
I will move up more to the front. This is Hank again. I think after seeing the output of the hackathon, I think we have a better understanding how abstracted operation will work for the architecture. And given the time of the next 4 to 8 weeks, we might even be able to give you contributions to the draft, not even reviewing it.
Great.
Because now we really understand what we are doing actually after the coding.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Does anybody, I guess, question, does anybody have an opinion, yay or nay, about moving some of the XMPP specific things around, or can they be left where they are, moved to an appendix, taken out completely? Guess we can move that on the list as well.
His question, take the list.
About what to do with the XMPP specific components, if they should be put in the appendix, left where they are, taken out. Ask that on the list. I think that was it. Cool. Thanks.
Thanks, Bill.
Hank, do you want to do terminology? I don't know if there's updates, but
Is this the box? Hi, this is Hank again. The terminology draft has not progressed, as was highlighted at the last IETF. When we will come at a point where we will be able to abstract the XMPP grid out of the architecture, we'll come back to revisiting some of the concept. I was reading the complete terminology 2 days ago, and it's still quite applicable. Surprisingly, what we do not have yet considered, and which was always outsourced into the terminology document where it does not belong, is the target endpoint characteristic profile. So what is that? That's a very long term, first of all. It's complicated, and it doesn't and the whole description is in the terminology. So what does it do? If you encounter a discernible endpoint, target endpoint, you want to assess in your network, and you don't know anything about it, you learn about it with different specific collectors, for example, a profiler, or a, I don't know, intrusion detection system or something like that. And then you get superficial information, but that's the best what you can get. So you aggregate these information somewhere, and you also have to label this information that you can find it again, so that you can recognize this device that you actually do not really know again when it reappears. So this is, of course, a best effort scenario. If people are smart enough, and this is an attack, they will change the identifying information elements about the target endpoint. So it cannot be, there won't be a consistent profile about it, but the concept exists. It somehow is now, I don't know, offloaded to the terminology. I hope there will be architectural considerations that will enable to pull that back into, for example, the architecture or some solution draft. Otherwise, at some point, we will give up on this concept, and the continuous monitoring of things we do not know will not be a thing. So that's just my consideration here. So I hope we will pick up on this again. And to let me reiterate, the terminology draft will proceed alongside the progress of the architecture. That's the only way we can do it at the moment. Otherwise, there's no. Otherwise, we would be the leading document to define how the architecture works. I don't think that's the way it should be. And the other thing is that there are still this one profile, characterization profile thing stored in there that should not be in there. That should go into a, higher level draft, I think. And that's my report. And next time I will request terminology time if there is something to report.
You could just say there's nothing to report.
On the way here, the one thought came up.
Oh, wait. Oh, no, you're good. Never mind.
So this is IETF SACM-20190327-1120. So we haven't made any changes since the last posted data tracker version, but we're in the process of making them. So a number of changes were made this week on the draft. We've, based on some of Chris's feedback, we worked to reduce some of the representational complexity of the media type. One of the challenges we're facing is it's a little underspecified from an ISO SWID tag perspective. The ISO SWID tag basically just points to the W3C specification for media type. We were attempting to try to correct that in the prior versions of CoSWID, but we just didn't have a lot to go on. So instead, I think what we're going to end up doing is just treating it as a text field and then again pointing to the W3C specification on the use of media type. So we'll have parity essentially with the ISO spec. We've enhanced the ability to include signature schemes in COSI so that now you can have multiple signatures. You can do co-signing and a few other capabilities. So that's in the editor's copy right now. We were looking through the normative language of the draft and noticed that there wasn't really any sort of top-level normative language for the model. We added a must statement that basically requires the minimal set of required attributes to make sure that, since it's a standards track document, that there's some top-level requirement to drive everything. Within the CDDL, we reordered the attribute names and sort of refactored how the integer labels are being declared. We believe that the new version is much more readable than the previous version, and so we're currently in the process of actually merging that into the inline CDDL that's in the document. So we have to finish populating those CDDL changes into the internet draft. And there's a few other small bits of work that remain. One thing that we talked about, I think last time that still remains is the creation of an IANA attribute registry to support CoSWID extension. So we want to take the current attributes that we have, the 50 or so, put them in a registry, and then have a registration process to allow updates to the model to be added over time. This will just make enhancements to the CoSWID model easier to do in a much more controlled way. It'll allow for some expert review of those changes as well. There's a few references that Chris had pointed out that could probably use a minor bit of editorial changes to sort of frame the references a little bit more. They're just kind of disembodied at the moment right now. So we need to do that. And then I think there were a few nits that you also had identified that we're gonna address. So the plan is to post an 09 version by the end of the week. And if we do so, we'd like to recommend that
that the document's ready for working group last call, at least as far as we feel. So would it be possible to move it forward?
So you're going to post by the end of this week?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, the remaining work is really not that much work, like a couple hours work. So we feel like what we have is pretty much ready to. We'll
Okay.
be pretty much ready to go by the end of the week.
all right. How many people have read this document so far?
3, 4.
Okay. Is there anybody objecting to going to working group last call? So I will remind folks that when we get to working group last call, we need to show that we need people to actually state publicly that they've read and reviewed this document, to show some consensus for it. And we can't show consensus if it's like the 2 authors and 1 other person. That's not a very big consensus. So thank you, Dave.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks.
Dave, before you leave, I have a quick question, maybe Hank, which is, so, I mean, if you put a Yang model in a document, right, there's, automated review and it comes through in the data tracker. Is there anything even a little bit close to that, like a CDDL in a document? Is there any validation that it's...
They're like a CDDL doctor's kind of review.
Yeah, it's
thing.
standing in front of you.
Okay, so it's all manual.
No, there's a tool chain to
No,
create and fuzz and validate everything you create with it.
I meant that it's not in kind of the data tracking, infrastructure, that it'll automatically pull out CDDL the way it will automatically pull out Yang.
No, CDDL is just an RFC editor cluster. I think before you can have a toolchain that pulls something out and says, hey, this is a normative standard, you should do it right, it has to be at least a proposed standard. And it is not one yet. It will be in a few days.
Still in last call, right? Or
It-
not
no,
last
it is-
call,
it
it's
is-
an
it's-
IESG.
No, it's an RFC editor. It's a cluster review.
Yeah, the IESG write-up, though, does require that the shepherd make sure that any schemas validate and those kinds of things. So I would guess it would be covered under that aspect.
Okay.
And if you need help with the tooling to do that, we could certainly help you.
It wasn't, I mean, I don't know if I was going to do it. I would like it to be done. I would like to have some assurance that if we're publishing I've read the schema, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm the world's best, compiler of CDDL schema. Yeah.
Okay, I have at least 2 other individuals that continuously read this, and that is Carsten Bormann and Klaus Hartke. So I think we have at least 2 people that have an idea that this is a consistent CDDL. Also, the tool tells you so. So, but there is no such thing as a CDDL doctor yet. And I think it would be overkill. The fact alone that you need Yang doctors means something. So I hope we do not need CDDL doctors, because that would mean something else.
I don't want to go off on a tangent too much, but for what it's worth, we've been putting XML schema in RFCs for ages, and there's still no automated XML schema system and data tracker. So I don't think there's ever going to be anything like that for CDDL either, probably.
Yeah, I wasn't necessarily hoping that it got into data tracker. I was just hoping for some amount of verification that what's in there is valid.
All right, thanks.
Did you take the clicker? It's hiding. Hold on a second.
Damn tall people. All right. Endpoint posture collection. So I'll tell you about some changes we've had since the 04 draft and go through a couple of next steps. The changes from the 04 draft are based on comments received on list and on the virtual interim. So what did we do? We clarified the scope of the ECP. The original scope was sort of broad, discussing not only how you collect endpoint posture data, but also how you continually assess that that posture information, how you'd share it with other tools, things on the network. There aren't standards for a lot of those things though, so it's making the draft seem kind of incomplete. So reduce the scope to focus really just on how you get the posture information from the endpoint, how to communicate that information to a centralized server. We still maintain the other components that we had originally discussed in the 04 draft, but it's now all very clearly identified as future work. Here are things you could do with this collected information, but we don't really define what you ought to do. We received feedback that the draft was long. We agreed. We tried to improve the readability of it. Mostly because as we're transitioning this to a best practices document, the readers really care about the technical details, not all of Jessica's great ideas about what you ought to do with the data. So we tried to change the draft to make it read more like a BCP. To do that, we consolidated a lot of the introduction information, removed a lot of the rationale text to an appendix. We explain the structure of the draft. It goes from, sort of the architectural to implementation to best practices to extensions. It moved all that into the intro so readers knew what they were looking at. A lot of our examples, particularly pertaining to NIA, we moved to an appendix. And we moved supported and non-supported use cases to the appendix. Yeah, we did a lot of fixing nits, addressing we adjust comments knowing that privacy information may not be owned by the enterprise. When we originally wrote this, it was sort of with the intention that the enterprise owns the data, but that's not always true. So we updated that, removed a lot of duplicative text, and fixed some of the diagrams. We elevated the API to an architectural component, but I did see your comments that was confusing. We will work to make that seem better, and we'll adjust your other comments as well. I feel like a lot of them seem to, the substantive ones, centered around understanding whether or not the posture is pushed from the endpoint or queried. It's both, right? So that wasn't super clear, so we will fix that. Next steps. Jessica's losing her will to live on this document, so presumably Danny is too, but Danny is so calm. I don't know. Maybe he's fine, but I need this to be over. So Adam and Bill had said they would help with some architectural alignment. We will integrate Chris's feedback. We'll publish an 05, and then I don't know. Either someone reviews it or we just accept that it's dead and Jessica can stop this now. I don't know.
Tell us how you really feel.
Tired, really tired. Thank you for asking. So yeah.
That is the best plea for review I have ever heard. If you people cannot review the document after that, we're all done. So volunteers, please.
Thank you. But see, it's all right, people who have agreed to review it, so okay, that's fine. So it was you, it was Steven, it was Dave.
Steven, Dave.
It's people who cared about Jess. Thank you. Thank you.
When do you need to finish?
Yesterday. You can, okay, yeah, we'll try to get a rev out. I can't promise this week, but I'll try to get one out in the next couple of weeks. Is that good? All right.
We have one in reserve.
Did you start one?
I signed it.
Yeah.
I went back that way.
There was one at the very beginning.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can they just tell me reviewers again so I can put it in there?
It was the gentleman sitting behind you. And Dave and Steven.
And Adam volunteered on online as well.
Thank you, Adam.
Yeah, yeah, I just,
That was me.
not as a chair.
Oh, I don't. Yeah.
So actually, so having actually read the document,
Thank you.
so it actually has a bunch of interesting comments with,
Hey, Bill.
it has a bunch of interesting comments with regard to actually architecture in there. Right. So it talks about how to integrate kind of what we're working on SACM from an XMPP kind of point of view. Although that's the minor part, it really talks about TCG, but it also then talks about NetConf and Yang.
Well, I would point out that it talks about Nia, but that's fine.
Fair enough, it does. You are
Yep.
correct. And it talks about how to maybe not, a separate comment from my review, maybe not coherently talks about the back end between if you had NetConf running push versus the TC or the NIA components running, right? It doesn't, it says they should just go into the same data store, but doesn't really, no profound thought past that necessarily.
So yeah, that's why we sort of moved the repo to feature it, because there isn't really a standout on how to necessarily do that. So
Absolutely
it
fair.
ought to do that, but
Absolutely
yeah.
fair comment. But so to the point of kind of review and other folks reading the document, it actually states some very interesting things about what SACM would look like and future parts of SACM, which you may or may not agree with, but you should absolutely read in order to kind of get their vision of how these things go together. And so some amount of me being at the mic as a contributor here, so Chris Inacio, is has anybody looked that far into the document and have any other thoughts? Because I find that part particularly interesting.
Thanks. Yeah, we accept negative comments too if it's not someone else's vision. Yeah. See, like,
Hi there, Eric Voigt. Just as an extra info, because you mentioned NetConf and push, right now at the ISG, it's not just NetConf and Yang push at the ISG, it's also HTTP push. And we've been talking about having a concise CBOR type of push as well. So if you're looking for other push mechanisms, don't think it's limited to just the NetConf transport.
I think that would be valuable if we could point out that there are other options. It would be wonderful if someone who knew about them could help with such a thing.
Excellent. Yes.
Thank you. Capture that, Bill. All right. Just Eric volunteered. That's right, Eric. Yeah.
Yes, I guess I did.
This is Stephen Bangard at the mic. I have like the most filler neutral comment about the name of the document as ECP, but the title of it is EPCP.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a great acronym, only made by the government. Right? Only. Yeah. So can I change the name, like the URL of the document at this point? Does anyone care? Like,
I mean, it's obviously not a big deal, but I mean, I can tell you that from just trying to pull up the slides in the document and everything, I was sitting there for a couple minutes like, is this the same document? Is this the same thing?
Right.
What is this ECP when the title is EPCP? Stuff like that. So
Okay. I think the answer is behind you.
Yeah,
The man with the answers is
Yeah.
behind you.
Ben Kaduk, yeah, you can still change it.
Okay.
You would have to resubmit it with a new name as a working group zero, or is it a working group? As a 00 of whatever appropriate form, and you can mark it as replacing the previous one, so that there's a link in between them.
That'll be like obvious somehow when I do that. Okay.
Dave Woltermeyer, I just wanted to point out the obvious. If it gets published as an RFC, then the URL doesn't matter anymore.
True. I mean, but if we're resubmitting it, then we could not upset Stephen. Yeah. Right. Yeah. All right. Is that good?
thank you. Did you add that to the agenda? Okay. Yeah, I saw it. They were in order. I guess we actually should have agenda bashed this, but we didn't.
Yeah. So I'm bashing late, I guess.
Yeah.
We talked about it. So this is something I put together as a contributor. So it talks a little bit about the information model. And Karen promised not to bludgeon me for doing this. But that was only actually because she said she was too tired.
None of us promised.
I know. That's why you're a little bit further that way. All right. So just some thoughts on the kind of the previous work we did on information model, right? So it was very ambitious. There's 417 elements in the -10, which is the last revision of that document. It felt like, kind of further refining that was a bit of an effort, probably because there was actually 417 data elements or information elements in there. I personally certainly felt like it was really hard to understand what was important in that, because we defined everything, it felt like. And I thought it became super hard to make any kind of trade-offs to think about data models. What would you actually do for an actual implementation? Because I really personally felt like there's a lot of, if you're going to make progress, have to boil the ocean there. So, kind of the talk, things that came up at the hackathon. What if we approached it from can we do the minimum viable set of things in order to make some of this stuff work? And so, just kind of, 15 minutes jotting down some thoughts of what's the minimum viable set. There's some super obvious ones, right? IP address host names. We absolutely know we need that. We need to be able to handle kind of dates, time, so the sample time and event time. Some real basic things of kind of co-SWID, SWID firmware revisions, to the point of kind of saying, hey, if I, leverage what's in the ECPC, and what endpoint posture collection profile. I'm just going to actually say the name because it's actually easier than remembering the acronym. We would need to know what those kind of core, what are those main points of what are in the kind of Yang profiles that we really find as being the most important. And then we need a handful of basics on what do people really use in practical terms for identifying an endpoint, right? So what's the naming anchor that's kind of currently used, right? So I think that's the kind of really basic minimal set. And I'm hoping the hackathon, kind of Bill and Karl Heinz, as they glue some of these disparate pieces together, I think there's huge knowledge that's gained from that, and understanding no, we only actually figured out how to exchange as kind of key fields as these 3 fields, because that went from what we have as a back end to what you have as a back end. And it's not clear to me that we need that much more. So that leads me to the kind of thought of what are the database keys that people use in kind of current systems for this? And do we need to standardize more than that to start building something that would allow us to exchange data?
Hi, this is Hank. As a rodent enthusiast speaking, there might be information elements that can tell you about the trustworthiness of the identifying attributes. And those would be super cool. And maybe that is something that is not the viable minimum, but again, viable to pursue.
Okay.
So just as a note.
All right. So thank you for being my plant in the audience for the next slide. Stephen?
Hi, this is Steven. I'm channeling Adam Montville over Jabber. So is another way to say this is to look at the workflows we're interested in tackling and extracting the minimum set of things we want to see from those. If so, I completely agree. We are making good progress on exchange mechanisms. Now we just need to do what you said.
Yeah, so I would say I'm 90% in agreement with Adam's resummarization, only in that I don't know that I want to capture every detail of information we want to exchange. And if we have to exchange information that is maybe more complete in one of those information exchanges between systems, that I just need enough to be able to know what to ask for from one side to get to the other, and an ability to express how I'm sending the rest of the data so that both sides can agree that they can decode the larger part.
Okay, and Adam just follows up with, to me, trustworthiness can come after we have the minimum viable things.
So that goes to this slide. So, you know, being a lazy engineer, which I'm totally in that bucket. Go ahead, Hank.
Yeah, I have to respond to Adam, who cannot see me, so I'm waving at you right now. If you start with the minimal viable and then at trustworthiness, realize you have to refactor the whole thing. So this was the experience from 2 times reiterating this in different domains. So maybe just keeping that at the back of your head while assessing the minimal viable will save a lot of time.
Okay.
Nancy Cam-Winget, but also speaking as one of the chairs of the so-called rodent group. I agree that, okay, so if we start speaking about the trustworthiness and the attestations, then we're now building some cross-group domain, because the level of trust in the attestations is what the RATS group is doing. Now, speaking as an individual, I agree that we can take on that part after we define this.
So my approach to being I'm with you. My approach to being a lazy engineer is do that minimum viable part and then make extensions work. And so, but this has implications to how you do data models and what kind of data types you would exchange, right? Because I think what this implies, or this approach implies that there's an ability to exchange meta information about types, right? So it means I really want to be able to express another data type as part of however the data exchanges work, and give you the meta information about what we're going to exchange. So the minimum viable would potentially be the absolutely minimum mandatory to implement, and then also you must implement methods to understand these extension capabilities, right? So as we did, trustworthiness, any other forms of attestation, as we decide that, we should tackle, satellite, health and welfare, and somebody needs to figure out, what it means to be within the Van Allen belt versus without the Van Allen belt, some vendor or somebody else can do that, right? It doesn't need to happen in the working group to make that work, but we need to have enough of these meta elements, right? So kind of this, and I don't know what this set is. This is just me noodling, right? So name, basic data type, byte length, those things that are necessary, right? I need to know, is this a standard element or is this a vendor specified element? We eventually move this into IANA registry. So as a bunch of vendors say, yeah, hey, I exchanged that same piece of information, we can eventually agree on what that is and promote it. But so, just kind of historical knowledge of, what we've added in the past here. Somewhere in here, yeah, I have structures/composite in there. I'm more nervous about that as a thing. But, I think that there's some set of these things, if we could define them, it would allow us to do that. And we can keep that set that we need to focus on here and now really short. All right. So thoughts. Is this a workable way forward for the folks in the room? Can you see how this would or would not work for you? Could you build a repository that's smart enough to deal with this, such that if I, effectively, how painful would it be potentially to have a repository that might have significant hunks of blobs in it as a possibility, right? So if it's a data type you don't understand, you don't necessarily throw it away, but maybe you just kind of store it in an unexploded, you don't really know what's in there, but it's there. Ideally, it wouldn't be a new data format. I'm not really looking to reinvent a data model from scratch. So if somebody knows something that does this, where I don't have to have a predefined schema and a bunch of other things, I'd love to know what that is. This, I think, gives a well-defined way to make the set of translators from the different data formats and the different encodings that people need that enables the kind of interoperability we've talked about. So thoughts?
This is Hank again. Question 4.
Yeah.
Can it be dumb enough to store it? Yes. You were talking about blobs. They're opaque.
Right, exactly.
So basically, you don't have to be smart. You just have to be very careful with that. And yes, there is actually the software we brought has a feature that eliminates metadata and identifier checking, just stores it into the map. And if you are doing something crazy there, like gigabytes of data, it will break. So maybe you can have some minor filters with the size restrictions, but a repository can be smart and record what types it has in there. And especially if it does not know the type, you can still use it. So this is a developer mode, we call it. Because if you want to have it in production, probably that's not the best idea ever. But if you start experimenting with using it and using your own data model, extending it, and sometimes you just emit data and the graph really doesn't know what the semantics are, you can still allow it to basically categorize it as, and this is a typing thing, as an identifier or as a metadata, and then it's in there. So we have this today, and I think that's a way to go forward with development and with vendor-specific extensions and enable lazy engineers to just start on and just throw something in there. But I don't think that's a valid way as a standard way to use it. So yeah, maybe there are different opinions about this.
Would people like to see a draft on this? On this fleshed out a bit more of, what, a minimal information model and what that would look like?
Oh, the question, let me rephrase what I just understood. Does SACM need an information model? Yes. Does it has to be the same as we had? No. Maybe giving more structural information, like how to nest things and how to name them and how to extend it would be helpful. And having a minimal set of then is basically working as an example and also as a viable minimum, that would be a good middle ground for an information model. And I would say yes. If that is the answer, yes.
That's the longest yes I've ever heard.
Adam Montville voices his support for a draft on Jabber.
How about does anybody not want to see something like this? I mean, obviously take this to the list, but looking for the room's response too.
Well, I guess I would ask, I mean, if somebody wrote this draft, I mean, we seem to be struggling to get reviewers. Are there people out there that are actually willing to read this draft? Should it be published? Oh, wow. Just a little bit more enthusiasm. And Adam says... Oh,
Adam says yes.
Okay. Oh, yeah, it was worthwhile.
I don't get bludgeoned later.
Well, Right. I mean, I think part of this is we're seeing the positive impacts of doing the hackathon,
Yes.
and I think that that's a good thing. I just, we've spun a lot of cycles on this topic already, and
I don't want to write like another 60 pages to like put it on a shelf. That would be awful.
I think a year or two I referred to this as the pit of despair, but.
Just climb out of it.
That seems kind of appropriate, actually. All right, so this is the part of the agenda where we talk about next steps. I think we've identified 2 documents that will be close to going to working group last call by the in the very short future, as soon as we get a couple updates. We really need reviews to those. We have identified further work for the architecture draft and a new information model draft. We could do a quick. Oh, we did. So let's just do a quick exercise in assigning some dates to some of this stuff. Let me find my window. All right. So the Rolly, we should be working group last call the end of the week. Yeah. Now, right. Oh, you did publish the update. Okay, excellent. So, so assuming we get reasonable response, let's look at the calendar. We could say, so April for working group last call.
Dave Waltermeyer, maybe propose like 3 weeks, because that'll give people time to decompress after the IETF.
Yeah, I usually, if I do working group last calls close to an IETF, I make them at least 3 weeks. And sometimes I've had to extend them. So yeah, so at least 3 weeks for that one. So if we go to working group last call April, then we should look at submitting to the IESG before the next IETF meeting, right? There should be no reason why we can't do that. Okay. COSWID was also ready for working group last call.
Dave again. So if we can publish an updated draft by the end of the week, then the same timeline would
apply.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's reasonable to think we could working group last call April, submit to IESG by the next IETF. Okay. The draft formerly known as ECP.
I had a quick comment regarding
okay.
the previous 2 drafts really quick. The Rolly software descriptor draft references COSWID. So it would actually be really good if they go through together.
Okay.
Because then we can resolve that linkage as easily as possible.
Right.
So for the document formerly known as ECP, I can have another draft out maybe in 3 weeks, 4 weeks. I'm trying to build in a buffer, so I don't want to be annoying, but longer is better. Right?
Okay. So we have a like 1st of May for a new draft on that.
Okay.
So Jessica, do you think that's likely to be the last revision, or?
How about the last one I
So I would strongly encourage people then to read that draft now. If they have any last comments, to send them to Jessica. She has warned us she's not going to keep revising this document. So, All right, so it's ACP, architecture.
Yeah, this is Bill. Yeah, another revision around that same timeline, 3 or 4 weeks. You know, in conjunction with some of the work on some of those information model elements that Chris is talking about, that'll help us move that forward together as well.
Okay. All right.
So I'll write a information model draft, but I would, before kind of really putting it out there, I'd like to actually send it to Hank and Adam and you, Bill, and some others, just to kind of say, you know, so the folks who've kind of more hackathon, frankly, participation, to say that, like, did I get this really, really wrong? And then post for kind of an actual look. Does that sound reasonable to? Okay.
So that's everything, because another database there. Okay, so based on that, it seems to me that it makes sense to have a virtual interim meeting mid-May. So just looking, I mean, we'll do a poll and all of that later, but just to get some ideas, if we do it like the week of May 6th, do we think the work in advance will be done? Any known major conflicts for that week? Or the week of May 20th? That's the other one I was looking at. Nope. May 20th is better. Okay. All right. Well, we'll do a quick poll on the mailing list to see when people can participate, but that was the rough time frame. And nothing from the Jab Room. All right. With that, is there any other business? Open mic? Questions? Comments? With that, we adjourn the SACM meeting and give you back a little extra time in your day.